Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Isabella Tobarovsky. I'm a senior program associate at the Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the remembrance of Soviet victory in World War II, in particular, the tension and competition between Russocentric and internationalist conceptions of victory in the Soviet Union and Russia. I would like to thank the History and Public Policy program for co-sponsoring today's event. I encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. I especially would like to plug our latest Russia File podcast episode, Crumbling Memory, with David Hoffman, Ivan Kurila, and Max Trudolubov, where we discussed questions of Russian historical memory. Also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. Finally, I would also like to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for their generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships, which has allowed us to host rising scholars in the field, such as our guest today, Dr. Jonathan Brunstedt. If you have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event and we'll move to your questions following the presentation. So I will start by introducing our speaker, then give him an opportunity to deliver some remarks, and then we'll turn to questions. Jonathan Brunstedt is an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University and a recent Title VIII research scholar with the Kennan Institute. His research focuses on nationalism and cultural memory in the Soviet Union and wider world, with a particular emphasis on the representation and commemoration of war. His book, The Soviet Myth of World War II, Patriotic Memory and the Russian Question in the USSR, published by Cambridge University Press, examines official notions of patriotism and patriotic identity in the USSR through the lens of World War II's public remembrance. Previously, Jonathan was an assistant professor of European history at Utah State University and a visiting fellow at the Loyalties Institute in Helsinki. Jonathan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for moderating, to the Wilson Center and Kennan Institute for hosting. My recent stint at the Kennan was for an entirely new project. However, the book I'm going to be discussing today actually began in part through a Kennan Institute grant. So it's quite exciting for me to be able to present some of the findings here today. Okay. Well, I'd like to begin with this scene here. It depicts a banquet of May 24th, 1945, roughly 2 weeks after Victory Day, organized to honor the commanders of the Red Army and Navy for their role in the recent victory over Germany. Roughly 1,000 officers and leading representatives of the party and state attended the banquet. The mood was festive, even raucous. Performances by famed ballerinas and opera singers punctuated the evening, as did frequent toasts. It was well after midnight when Stalin rose from his table to give one final toast. And this is what's depicted here in this scene. I would like to raise a toast, he declared, to the health of our Soviet people, and most of all, the Russian people. The Russian people had, quote, earned in this war general recognition as the guiding force of the Soviet Union. It was the trust of the Russian people in the Soviet government, Stalin declared, that was, quote, the decisive force that ensured the historic victory over the enemy of mankind, over fascism. When the text of the toast was reprinted on the front page of Pravda the next day, reactions varied. Certainly many welcomed Stalin's admission that the Soviet victory rested on a Russian foundation. Often such powerful feelings take possession of the soul, one soldier wrote in his diary on May 27th. How much I contemplated, experienced, reading Comrade Stalin's address. He spoke about us Russians with such warmth. Others were more ambivalent. A reported conversation between Moscow factory employees conveyed confusion. Quote, it is unclear why Stalin only spoke about the Russian people, one of the men noted. In fact, Ukrainians and other peoples endured greater difficulties and fought heroically against the enemy. Another worker expressed concern that Stalin's statement might lead to, quote, excessive pride and the contraposition of one Soviet nation against another. One agronomist argued that had such a statement been made not by Comrade Stalin, but by someone else, he would be accused of great power chauvinism. Now, scholarly interpretations have understandably argued that this toast played a foundational role in later Soviet war memory. Historians of Stalinism, for example, contend that Stalin's Russocentric view of the war, quote, flowed together with the veneration of 1,000 years of Russian history, so that the war's official memory functioned primarily to assert Russian primacy within the Soviet ethnic hierarchy. This view is also widely held among scholars of the post-Stalin period, where a late socialist commemorative cult of the war is largely presumed to be an outgrowth of the state's support for a degree of pro-Soviet Russian nationalism, which became a mobilizing tool during the 1960s and 70s. Now, this heavily Russified and Russian-focused memory of the war is what I expected to find when I began research for this book years ago. And looking at current events with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the use of the war's memory to justify this horrific act, it's easy to assume that it was always thus, that the war's historical memory, even in Soviet times, was mainly a Russian thing, a way of reinforcing the Russian-dominated hierarchy of peoples. In fact, as I'll discuss today, the Soviet myth of the war victory functioned in ways that routinely downplayed the Russian people and their historical pedigree in favor of a decidedly post-revolutionary and supranational imagined community, the Sovietsky Narod, or the Soviet people. My book argues that the war's memory encapsulated a range of competing ideological tendencies, which coalesced in the post-Stalin era to form a pan-Soviet or internationalist counterpoint to broader notions of Russian leadership and Russian-led ethnic hierarchy. While Russocentric historical narratives of the pre-revolutionary and early Soviet eras continue to stress Russian benevolence and assistance on the path to modernity, the official story of the war evolved as a parallel but countervailing ideological current, which worked to flatten hierarchical configurations among Russians and non-Russians alike. At the same time, many contested this notion of a horizontally integrated Soviet political community. The book shows how a Russophile faction of party elites, nationalist intellectuals, and even some non-Russian party organizations in the republics perpetuated a Russocentric understanding of the war from below. I contend that the competition between these Russocentric and pan-Soviet conceptions of victory, which burst into the open during the late 1980s, reflected a wider struggle over the nature of patriotic identity in a multi-ethnic society that continues to reverberate in the post-Soviet space. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus my comments on the book's three major interventions, which I categorize as wartime threads, discursive tension, and the doctrine of the Soviet people. Since I'm centering my comments on the book's argument at the expense of narrative breadth, I'm skipping over a lot, but anything of interest that I don't cover, I'd of course be happy to discuss later. So the book's first major contention is that Stalinist appeals to Russian nationalism, or more accurately, Russocentrism, were merely one of several competing patriotic strands that vied to define the war's memory in the post-war era. By the war's end, as Soviet propagandists and ideologists terminated certain wartime appeals, such as those pertaining to non-Russian heroic pasts, the various remaining mobilizational threads coalesced to form two prevailing ideological paradigms, each of which presented a distinctive version of the war narrative, or the victory myth. The first, a Russocentric tendency, was a direct extension of wartime and pre-war Russocentric propaganda, epitomized in iconography and messaging that harked back to the pre-revolutionary past, and later by Stalin's toast to the Russian people. Its essence involved positioning the Great Patriotic War along a 1,000-year continuum of Russian martial struggles. This tendency was multi-ethnic in the sense that it highlighted the state's ethnic diversity and Russians' leading place within a highly variegated population. It was Soviet in that it cited the Soviet system, party leadership, and socialism as important wartime factors. But the Russocentric paradigm presented Russian leadership and historical pedigree as fundamental, even overriding ingredients to victory. Now, the other dominant post-war tendency involved appeals firmly rooted in the Soviet era, its unique achievements, and the motif of a socialist motherland inhabited by a super-ethnic community of Soviet people. This pan-Soviet or internationalist paradigm was highly statist and patriotic in the sense that it advocated what Martin Malia has called the patriotism of socialism in one country. It was Russified in its emphasis on Russian as the language of interethnic communication. Its internationalism was domestic, that is, reflecting friendship bonds among Soviet nations. But unlike the Russocentric paradigm, the pan-Soviet or internationalist tendency maintained an uneasy, if not antagonistic relationship to both Russian-led hierarchy and pre-Soviet patriotic motifs. The concept nearly always served to underscore the depth of the 1917 revolutionary divide, the novelty, as opposed to the antiquity, of the Soviet people, and the primacy of a supranational and post-revolutionary sense of political identity. Put simply, the pan-Soviet line portrayed the Soviet people at war as bound not by Russian leadership, but by lateral loyalties and supra-ethnic institutions, the Soviet political and economic system, socialist ideology, Communist Party leadership, and so on. I hold that these contending patriotic paradigms advance contrasting ideas about collective belonging and loyalty, and constitute contradictory approaches to Soviet multi-ethnic governance. And so during the war, you see these contrasting expressions of patriotism articulated quite clearly. I'll just give a few examples, just one example here. So in November 1941, Stalin famously reached back to the great ancestors of the Russian people in his memorable Red Square address. Now, contrast this with the comments of historian M.V. Nechkina, her 1944 vision of a post-revolutionary Soviet people forged by the Great Patriotic War. Her comments typified a pan-Soviet conception of Soviet identity. The experience of the war had forged a new Soviet people, which is not a nation, a natia, but something higher and fundamentally new and novel in the history of mankind. Now, how authorities struggled to reconcile these Russocentric and pan-Soviet tendencies after 1945 is the book's second major theme. Now, many scholars have argued that out of the war, there emerged an ideological amalgam of sorts, which in the words of one scholar, blended images of the Russian past with those of the Soviet past and present. I contend that these two dominant mobilizational paradigms did not so much fuse as constitute a set of divergent patriotic discourses that Soviet leaders, ideologues, and propagandists time and again were unable or unwilling to harmonize into a coherent ideological amalgam. What I call discursive tension was the eventual outcome of the failed attempts at ideological harmonization. It involved positioning what were two distinct patriotic paradigms at the opposite poles of an ideological spectrum. In the post-war era, that is under Stalin, the war narrative itself embodied this tension. Late Stalinism tolerated the coexistence of rival Russocentric and internationalist victory narratives. This enabled a surprisingly fluid mobilizational repertoire, which the leadership used to promote either Russian leadership and ethnic diversity, or the idea of a homogeneous Soviet people as the changing domestic and international landscape required. So as the 1940s wore on, the leadership deployed either the pan-Soviet or Russocentric version of the victory myth, depending on the specific context. So why would this be? Well, one of the main reasons has to do with the Cold War's escalation in the post-war years. In the Western World War II narratives that were emerging at exactly this time, Soviet successes were often attributed to notions such as traditional Russian nationalism, winter conditions, even the Russian soul, all in spite of Stalin, the Communist Party, and Soviet system. So in some ways, the Russocentric understanding of the war played into Western narratives. One way to counter this was by presenting a purely pan-Soviet interpretation of the war victory. Another reason has to do with Soviet messaging abroad. As the leadership was well aware, the USSR's appeal as a beacon of socialism after 1945 hinged on its defeat of Nazism and had little to do with assertions of Russian exceptionalism, either in a historical or contemporary guise. The two paradigms also had their own advocates within the leadership and among the intelligentsia, further complicating attempts at ideological fusion. So there was actually a great deal of utility from Stalin's perspective in not merging these ideological lines, but rather in compartmentalizing them as much as possible. And in the book, I illustrate how this worked by focusing on late Stalinist war memorial projects, city rebuilding, the expansion of the Moscow metro, changes to the Stalin cult, as well as public festivals and anniversary commemorations, marking key events from the Soviet and Russian past. Now, the book's third major assertion and the final intervention I'll mention here is what I call the doctrine of the Soviet people, which reconceptualized how this discursive tension operated throughout the post-Stalin era. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign conflated much of the wartime Russocentric imagery and messaging with the excesses of Stalin's personality cults. This discredited the Russocentric victory narrative in the process, right? So things like Stalin's toast were rejected as promoting Russian chauvinism and as being antithetical to the meaning and legacy of victory. These are just images from a couple of the cases I look at in the book. Now, this actually dovetailed with one of Khrushchev's major ideological projects, which was the, quote, return to the Soviet present. That is the creation of a post-1917 usable past dissociated from Russian-centered patriotic models from the pre-revolutionary era. For the Khrushchev leadership, victory in the Great Patriotic War was to be the crowning achievement of a teleology that began in 1917, and decidedly not the culmination of a 1,000-year Russian triumphalist through line. This is also the line that Brezhnev would advance as he expanded the war's commemoration, as well as all other Soviet leaders through Gorbachev, although there are continual Russocentric challenges to this dominant pan-Soviet myth. Put simply, rather than tolerate contrasting Russocentric and pan-Soviet variations on the war's memory, as Stalin had done, Khrushchev and his successors put forth the pan-Soviet victory myth as the sole official narrative of the war. This is not to say that Russocentrism disappeared. Rather, the Soviet people doctrine formalized the Stalinist practice of siloing Russocentrism within pre-revolutionary and early Soviet narratives. This is very crude, I realize, and I made it in a fever dream late last night, but the doctrine worked something like this. Another way of thinking about this is that the doctrine offered a means of managing what were contrasting hierarchical and lateral expressions of Soviet patriotic identity. And if this sounds too neat, I'd point out that the doctrine stemmed directly from conclusions drawn by a series of important commissions between 1957 and the mid-1960s, such as the Commission on the New Party Program, the Drafting Commission for a New Official 6-Volume History of the Great Patriotic War, and others. These commissions involved hundreds of ideological workers divided into dozens of working groups, the solicitation of public comments, and the direct involvement of high-ranking party officials like Khrushchev, Suslov, Pospelov, and others. The results of the commission show that this doctrine constituted an agreed-upon framework for the expression of Soviet patriotism, wherein notions of Russian leadership of an ethnically diverse community of peoples were bound to the narrative spheres of pre-revolutionary and early Soviet modernization, while the theme of the World War II victory was to rest at the opposite pan-Soviet end of a mobilizational spectrum. Now, following its announcement at the 22nd Congress in 1961, we see the new doctrine reflected almost immediately in the war's public representation. Of course, this is the period when you get the renaming of Stalingrad to Volgograd. Where there was previously ambiguity over the place of the Russian people and their historical provenance in depictions of the war, we now see a decisive rejection of Russocentric war narratives. Here I'll just highlight the drafting of the official 6-volume history of the war. Now, the last 2 volumes, 5 and 6, were completed after the introduction of the Soviet people doctrine, and hence reflected the war's decidedly pan-Soviet orientation. The initial volumes looked for other ways. They sought ways to explain away Stalin's Russocentric statements. So, for example, Stalin's great ancestor speech in volume 2 was simply adjoined by commentaries such as this, where the emphasis is on the Soviet people, on the socialist homeland, and so on. So it's trying to explain away Stalin's statement here. In the final volumes, you see more explicit attempts to alter or outright remove such Russocentric statements. So, for example, last-minute changes were made to the 5th volume, which covered the end of the war, so that it could incorporate the Soviet people doctrine. Now, what did these changes entail? Well, just before the commission submitted the manuscript to the printer in July 1962, one of its members made final edits by hand, striking through, among other things, the entirety of Stalin's toast to the Russian people, and substituting in its place an inclusive pan-Soviet alternative that made reference to the sons of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Moldova, and so on. Likewise, the commission's approach to the 6th and final volume of the series, which was devoted to explaining the war's overall significance and the factors that led to victory, embodied the new pan-Soviet orientation of the Soviet people doctrine from the ground up. I'll just give some of the comments from the drafting team as they discussed various points about how to portray these sources of victory in the 6th and final volume. As the writing of volume 6 was getting underway, a researcher for the commission by the name of Prokofiev detailed what he saw to be one of the fundamental challenges of the final volume: to once and for all eliminate the idea of Russian superiority. The commission assigned M.G. Zhuravkov to specifically address this matter in the volume's chapter on ideology. Zhuravkov and his team looked to condemn manifestations of Russocentrism as both features of the Stalin cult and fodder for Western historians seeking to distort the nature of Soviet patriotism. Zhuravkov pointed in particular to, quote, the introduction of officer and general ranks, epaulets in the Red Army, the appeal to the courageous images of our people's great ancestors, Menem, Pozharsky, Nevsky, Suvorov, Kutuzov. According to Zhuravkov, Western commentators exploited such wartime measures by suggesting that they were, quote, an attempt to reinforce socialist ideology with the revival of the vanished greatness of old Russia, unquote. Along these lines, Zhuravkov went so far as to describe, quote, the serious damage to the understanding of the character of the Great Patriotic War caused by Stalin's appeal to the great ancestors, and so on. Now, among other things, the framework of the Soviet people doctrine helps explain the rise of the late socialist war cult beginning in the 1960s. This is a process I examine in great detail in the book, but put simply, de-Stalinization produced a legitimacy crisis, but also a perceived crisis of patriotic identity. That is, whether Soviet patriotism should hinge on Russian leadership and historical pedigree, or on exclusively Soviet and post-revolutionary qualities, whether it should be ethnically hierarchical and culturally diverse, or lateral and aspiring to some shared supranational ideal. Amid these debates, it was eventually determined that only the war's memory could come close to bridging the gaps and masking ideological contradictions. Therefore, as I show, the war cult, its ubiquitous monuments, rituals, and mass media productions deliberately emphasized key areas of overlap with nationalist priorities, such as devotion to motherland, patriotism, and most importantly, the dissemination of these values among Soviet youth. The idea was to channel the energy of Russian cultural nationalism in a pan-Soviet direction where possible, or to silo this nationalist energy within the designated spheres of pre-revolutionary patriotic culture and early Soviet development. But even during the late socialist period, conflicts persisted, whether in discussions for the cult's many war monuments, Victory Day celebrations, factions within planning committees for public festivals, among other forums. The establishment of a dominant myth was an internally contested process. Gorbachev's partial liberalization of Soviet life brought these contests into the open and launched the series of renewed Russocentric challenges to the official memory promoted by the Soviet state. These came not just from pro-Soviet nationalists and neo-Stalinists, but from various other proponents of a reinvented Russia, whose views range from radical ethno-nationalism to liberal reformism. My book closes on these glasnost era debates. So in lieu of a conclusion, I'd just like to offer a couple of ways that my book speaks to the present. One of Putin's major projects has been to situate achievements of the Soviet era, and especially the World War II victory, obviously, within a larger Russian historical context. Referring to this challenge, Putin noted in 2012 that, quote, "We need to link historical eras together and revert to understanding the simple truth that Russia did not begin in 1917 or even 1991, but rather that we have a single uninterrupted history spanning over 1,000 years." The Putin-led resurgence of a myth of victory, one that could bridge the country's deep economic, ethnic, and political divides, has served as the cornerstone to this nation-building project. All the while, Russian national war memory has reflected the complex and often paradoxical legacies of Soviet myth-making, which simultaneously advocated lateral and hierarchical, post-revolutionary and trans-historical, homogenizing and variegating patriotic discourses and loyalties. Post-Soviet Russia has seen these tensions reproduced to an extent in the divide between civic territorial, Rossiyski, and ethnic, Ruski, conceptions of Russian nationhood, as well as in the more recent notion of a transnational Russian world, Ruski Mir. These competing official visions of Russianness have evolved from a singular focus on an inclusive civic identity during the 1990s and early 2000s to a brief flirtation with ethno-nationalism, to the more recent approach, which involves, in the words of one scholar, deliberately blurring the borders of the Russian ethnic self. Notwithstanding the vastly differing political and ideological context, the impulse behind the Kremlin's frequent appeals to the war victory as an elastic source of patriotic identity, one capable of accommodating the fluctuations and ambiguities of the Russian idea, is a product of the Soviet era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So I see that we have some questions coming up in the Q&A. I actually want to ask you a couple of questions on my own, perhaps, to start with. And one is, you talk in the book about, and I think the concept comes from somebody else, but you describe it really well, the hierarchical heroism, how during the Soviet time, some ethnic groups their contribution to the war effort was acknowledged and others wasn't. And within that context also, I think that we can see already in that history how the fight against Ukrainian nationalism can already be seen in the interpretations of the war, of who Ukrainians fought for, right? What were their aspirations? So I wonder if you can address that in those kind of more specific ethnic relations terms.
Sure, and right, I should say so. Amir Viner has, of course, termed this concept of hierarchical heroism. And the idea is that, you know, during the war, groups that were targeted for excision, as Viner says, or ethnic deportation, you know, which largely was moving communities away from border regions and put into the Soviet interior for, but they were suspected en masse, you know, deemed guilty as a group, right? These groups were excluded, obviously, from the victory narrative initially. But they were excluded, but they, you know, the Soviet people, the pan-Soviet version of this also downplayed the Russian role. I mean, it was just the Soviet people, this big collective mass who was victorious here. But you're absolutely right. Groups that were suspected of disloyalty, this is something I do talk about in the book, were not part of this victory narrative. And, you know, talking about Ukraine, what's interesting, yes, there was all sorts of talk about Ukrainian collaboration and things like this. However, the Soviet war myth, unlike what we see today, actually recognized the Ukrainian nation, and it did recognize them as a distinct people, and it recognized their contribution to the war. It wasn't like you see today where Putin is basically treating Ukrainians as little Russians, you know, which is a much older imperial idea. It wasn't like that, at least in the narrative of the war. The war did recognize Ukrainians as real fighters in this war. At the same time, I should say that in these debates that were taking place in the late 50s and 60s, Ukraine plays a very special role. And just to go back to the example of the history of the Great Patriotic War, that official 6-volume history, well, the first 2 volumes didn't really deal with multi-ethnic relations hardly at all. What happens is internal debates as they're writing this history, somebody points out, there were actually complaints from Ukrainians saying, look, we're being depicted here. There's a photo in one of the volumes that depicted, the caption said, these are Ukrainian collaborators, right? In fact, it was a still from a Nazi propaganda video, and actually the collaborators in the still were Russian collaborators, not Ukrainians. And this sort of sparks a real debate and sort of panic within the commission dealing with this. And so they start saying, well, wait, okay, so we're misrepresenting Ukrainians here in this picture. We need to really address this issue of multi-ethnic friendship and so on. So it's actually this controversy over Ukraine, the status of Ukraine as it's being depicted in these early volumes, that leads to a much larger discourse internally about, well, wait a sec, we have other problems here. This is now we're just like Russian chauvinists. So the point is, by the 60s, they were dealing with this. They were addressing it. They realized it was a problem. And just to culminate, in 1965, of course, you get the 20th anniversary of Victory Day, when a lot of historians say the war cult really takes off from this period. Interestingly, in Brezhnev's Victory Day speech, and this is the first time this has happened, he lists the various Soviet peoples. And again, we're talking about the titular republics here, right? So this would implicitly exclude deported peoples. But he lists them not by their supposed contribution in wartime, which often puts Slavs first, but by population size of the republic. So this is a major shift, and it happens in the late 50s and early 60s, where you get a reconsideration about how the Soviet state, how these narratives were depicting multi-ethnic governance and multi-ethnic patriotism and loyalty. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. I was also thinking about, I think because of the time that we're in now, the references to Ukraine were particularly jumping out at me. So in one place you talk about how at some point the propaganda begins to, I think it's in the immediate post-war era, that they propose to look at the pre-war era through the lens of the war, as in to justify everything that had happened before the war, in which of course Ukraine had suffered probably, I don't know if I can compare, but heavily, right? You have the Holodomor, it's collectivization, all the horrors of that. So they're proposing to say, well, look, Comrade Stalin, this is through his foresight, this helped us prepare for the invasion, which was inevitable. So I don't know if you can maybe perhaps talk more about that, whether that was something that, did they in fact implement this lens? Did they use it? Did it did it stick? Did that idea stick?
Yes, absolutely. And there's documentation from even days before Victory Day 1945, days after Victory Day 1945. You have high-level people like Georgy Alexandrov, for example, outlining plans and how to sort of disseminate propaganda in recently liberated areas, which focused on Ukraine and Belarus and elsewhere. And the idea was to explain, and I think the exact quote that Alexandrov gives in a memo is, we need to explain every day how victory in this war is thanks to Stalin's foresight and thanks to the radical transformations that the Soviet state has implemented since the 1930s. So collectivization, industrialization, everything gets lumped into this being part of the war narrative, part of Stalin's foresight. I'm not the first person to notice this, but I do have a lot of documentation proving beyond a doubt. And so what's happening here, though, is there's not really a need any longer to say that, oh, we're continuing Alexander Nevsky's legacy or whatever. It becomes about the Soviet system, right? This system that Stalin had largely built. This system was what made us durable during the war, that allowed us to victory. And so, Ukrainian nationalists continue fighting in the Baltics and elsewhere after the war. The approach was not to promote Russian nationalism or say how great Russians were. This just would have inflamed those the continued fighting in those regions. Because look, they're saying that this is Russian nationalism that they're promoting or whatever, or Russian historical greatness or whatever have you. This was an ineffective propaganda line in these regions, and this played a major role in the shift to a pan-Soviet victory narrative. Especially from 1944 already, but especially in those first years after the war. What you get, though, is in 1947, 48, you get celebrations of great Russian pre-revolutionary events like the founding of Moscow's, the anniversary of the founding of Moscow, for example, and you get a Yuri Dolgoruki foundational stone put there and everything. So you get this pan-Soviet narrative of the war, often clashing with larger patriotic mobilizing celebrations of pre-revolutionary Russia and other things. And I actually document in the book how these two ideas came together and how they were negotiated by party leaders and others.
Well, this is interesting. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll switch to questions that are coming through in the Q&A. Wouldn't you say that they're still applying this lens today in a way, that a lot of what happened in Russian history gets kind of covered or glossed over by this victory in the war? And I get this idea from this conversation that we had on the Russia File podcast episode, where Max Trudolubov said, and he said it in a recent event at Canon also, that essentially this victory in the war gave kind of a get out of the jail free card for many Russians. It was like, well, we always were on the right side of history. Look at our victory in the war. Look at how we defeated the Nazis. And so a lot of the memory work that needed to happen to deal with the darker sides of Russian Soviet history primarily, I would say, never happened, such as whatever human rights violations. As he says, whatever is happening today in Ukraine, a lot of these things happened also in other wars that the Soviet Union conducted, and we never addressed that, and we need to address that. So what do you think about this idea?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. In fact, the project that I was at the Kennan for most recently deals a little bit with this. I mean, you could look at subsequent Soviet interventions, right? So take Afghanistan intervening in 1979. There's others too, but in every one of these cases, you get an initial sort of framing that we're refighting World War II, right? We're trying to clamp down on fascism wherever it appears. This is something that really sustained the Cold War. An idea that you know, there's a famous propaganda poster, a Soviet propaganda poster from 1948, and it's the title of it is Ne balui, you know, something like "Don't force around" or "Don't fool around." And it's a World War II veteran holding a history of the Great Patriotic War, and he's chiding a top-hatted industrialist holding an atomic bomb, you know, obviously an American. The message here is, if World War II teaches us anything, it's that fascism is going to arise from you know, the excesses of capitalist imperialism. Okay, so in the post-war era, with the Nazis defeated, well, where might a new Hitler or fascist movement emerge? Well, obviously it's going to come from the West, and obviously it's going to come from the United States. So you get this rhetoric of fascism, anti-fascism on the Soviet side. And so the war, and I should say in the Americans' case, you get a similar reframing of the war. The war becomes about, oh, well, the World War II was about democracy versus totalitarianism, right? An idea that really came into its own after World War II, and George Orwell, Hannah Arendt, and others. And in this case, you have the West trying to equate Stalin and Soviet Stalinism with Hitler and Nazism. Okay, so you have an equal equation going on both sides. And in the Soviet case, though, you do get this rhetoric about fascism emerging, and this becomes a model of intervention elsewhere. It's a way to, and just like it justified their role in the Cold War, you know, from their perspective, it justified their interventions in other places. And so I think, and again, I'm really curious to look into how this worked out in the 90s as well. But yeah, so seeing Putin invoke World War II to sort of justify, say, this is our not just our duty or whatever, but it's our rights, you know, based on this memory of the war. This is something that has a long history to it, and something that, you know, for I think a lot of people who know this history, it wasn't very surprising to see him immediately try to frame events like this. Of course, this war has been going on since 2014. And in 2014, we saw a huge deployment of imagery of the war and things like this.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from David Sobelson, who's asking, to what extent did the ideological conflict between Stalin and Trotsky over whether to prioritize socialism worldwide or in the USSR affect, oops, the question just disappeared.
Yeah, I saw it disappear. I think I got it. Yeah, so you noted there, I quoted the historian Martin Malia, who describes the patriotism of socialism in one country.
Yes.
And so this idea, debates between Stalin and Trotsky, or, after Lenin's death, you have this leadership struggle. And one of the positions, of course, that Stalin takes is that we need to build socialism in one country rather than emphasizing, international revolution, right? And this, obviously, there was a political element here. Stalin was appealing to average Russian, or I guess by this point, average Soviet sort of nationalism in a way, right? It was much more appealing for many people. So Stalin took the more popular course here, which was socialism in one country. We're gonna create the Soviet Union as a bastion of socialism. And so this form of patriotism, though, was often interpreted in the West as this is creating a neo-Russian empire, or it's a new kind of Russian nationalism or something. It was nothing of the sort. It was a base of socialism that, were surrounded by enemies. The worldwide revolution didn't happen or unfold as we expected. So we need to defend the gains of October. This is actually a rallying cry during the war itself, defending the gains of October. That's what this type of patriotism is all about. And of course, to contrast what Trotsky was advocating, permanent revolution, continual efforts to push revolution abroad and around the world. So I think what you see in this pan-Soviet victory narrative much later in the war really comes out of this doctrine of socialism in one country, for sure.
Very interesting. So we have a question from Susan Welsh, which interests me immensely because as a native Russian speaker, the question of articles always fascinates me in English. So in Stalin's toast, how do you know he meant the decisive force rather than a decisive force? Since Russian has no articles, does it matter? Explain this to me.
I mean, maybe it matters to some people. It probably doesn't matter to me. And I think other people, involved in this debate, I think the context would strongly imply that we're talking about the decisive force here. But let's suppose that the article was wrong, that I'm putting a definite article, whether it really should be an indefinite article. So Russia was a decisive force. To me, that rings a little odd, right? A decisive force. Okay, there were other decisive forces, but Russia was a decisive force. Okay, what does it matter? Is he singling out other decisive forces? No, he's singling out one decisive force. So I think I'm standing on I'm not a native Russian speaker, but I do think I'm standing on good grounds as a historian to argue that the context suggests strongly that the definite article is probably the more appropriate translation than the indefinite.
I agree with you that I think it's unlikely that he would have in this major speech allowed for other decisive forces to.
Something I talk about in the book, there's all sorts of apocryphal stories about this toast, of course. And so it's funny, thank you for that question, by the way. It is funny because commentators long after the fact talked about this toast. They would say like, oh, one of these comes from Zhdanov's son, who said that his father, Zhdanov, who was there, told him that what actually happened during this thing was that Stalin raised the toast to the Russian people, and all the people there said to the Soviet people, in opposition to what Stalin had said. And Stalin was really upset, and he repeated it really sternly, and everyone was really scared. There's no historical basis for this. It's just an idea. It's something that the younger Zhdanov claims to have heard. But this issue of articles, what did he really mean? It's a great question because these things have been debated. There's a whole apocrypha about this event.
That's great. All right, we have a question from Daniel Teodorou. Please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the name. Do you see Putin as a Russophile or Sovietophile? I actually want to broaden that. I mean, feel free to answer this question directly, but I also want to broaden it and maybe bring it back again to the way historical memory plays into the current conflict in Ukraine, because on the one hand, in a way, you see kind of, again, that dichotomy that you talk about in the book, because on the one hand, Putin talks about, this, and I think in recent years in general, victory has been Russian. Everything great that's been done in the war has been done by the Russian people. It's the Russian soldiers who have, gone out and brought back the victory. And in some ways, he denies implicitly the participation of other ethnic groups, including Ukrainians. But then you do see a shift when he talks about, well, of course, we fought shoulder to shoulder with you Ukrainian people, and now you are on the side of the Nazis. So there seems to be this, again, dichotomy. Perhaps it's well, anyway, I'll stop here, but tell me what you think about this.
I think, to be honest, I think over the last 22 years, his sort of view of history and things like this have evolved. Let me just say, I think that in the present, okay, in this present situation, it's much more a Russian sort of imperial ideology or worldview that he's advancing in his actions against Ukraine. I mentioned, for example, in Soviet times, there was always this, I mean, look, probably everybody watching this knows this, but when the Bolsheviks came to power, right, as Marxists, they believed that that people needed to pass through a stage of national consciousness and development. And so the Bolsheviks actively encouraged Ukrainians and especially other titular nations to advance their culture and ultimately to hopefully pass through that stage of cultural advancement into a higher stage of class consciousness, right? So superseding this artificial national consciousness to a higher stage and ultimately communism, okay? But in the meantime, they were very clearly differentiated between Russian, Ukrainian, and so on. That's not what Putin is doing now. And so I think he sort of, that quote from 2012, what he's trying to do is take all the victories of the Soviet period and merge them into a larger 1,000-year-long continuum, right? To me, that is not Soviet, that is not revolutionary, that is not Bolshevik. That is either Russian nationalist vision or more appropriately, probably a Russian imperialist type of ideology that's being advanced now. Now, what his view was like in the early 2000s and so on, I'd have to sort of go back and look at this a little bit. But really, I don't see him as sort of advancing anything like a recreation of the Soviet Union beyond an attempt at sort of geopolitical strength in the region that the Soviet Union certainly had.
Okay, thank you. We have a question regarding the participation of non-Russians in World War II and ethnic minorities in the current Russian war in Ukraine. So the question, I'll just read it out. So it says that it's interesting that in World War II and in the current war in Ukraine, that most of the fighting has been done by non-Russians. I'm not sure it's actually correct with regard certainly to the current war. I don't know about most, but we know that there's been heavy participation by the people from Buryatia, from Sakha, and other ethnic minorities from the Caucasus. Do you think, the question continues, do you think the sacrifices of these groups could result in future protests or unrest within Russia? Have ethnic tensions ever resulted in outright revolt in the Soviet Union or Tsarist Russia? So what do you think?
Yes, I'll just say that, Russians, in terms of all the Soviet ethnic groups during World War II, Russians, the most Russians died of any other Soviet nationality. That's not to say proportionally they were the greatest share of, other republics, especially Ukraine and Belarus, suffered greater proportional losses. But Russians suffered, unless my statistics are wrong, but Russians suffered the greatest absolute number of losses. Sorry, I'm trying to wrap my head around the question here. So the part about did ethnic tensions ever result in, the question's actually disappeared, but
Yeah,
did ethnic tensions ever result in uprisings? And the answer is certainly yes.
yes.
You can look at the Caucasus regions, and there were even, in the final days of the Soviet Union, there were even protests among Russian nationalists on the streets. I mean, by the late 1980s, you really have very few sort of ethnic constituencies willing to support the Soviet project, even Russians. I mean, this is something Jeffrey Hosking talks about in his book, that Russians, yeah, they were the most Soviet nation, as Stalin said, but they also felt like they were the victims of the Soviet system as well. These ethnic tensions played a major role in the Soviet Union's ultimate collapse. So I would say yes to that question.
I think what the question of I think the thrust of that question, this was part of the question, but the other part of the question was whether the fact that now you have ethnic minorities fighting on behalf of Russia in the war in Ukraine, will that empower them to then later say, look, we fought for Russia, we fought for Putin, so we have contributed, and then make some demands on that basis?
Man, this is asking me to predict what's going to happen. Which I've gotten a lot wrong in this current war. It's a difficult question. It's an important one. I will say that it's something we saw after World War II. People who fought in the war expected, or presumed that they had, and they were given in many cases, that they were seen as of a higher status, in the sort of post-war reestablishment of political control and elsewhere. You could go back into history where groups fighting against Napoleon, for example, came back to Russia, having witnessed life in France and elsewhere, and like the Decembrist uprisings and things like this. I mean, this does, of course, happen. But I'm hesitant to say if this is going to lead to any sort of ethnic uprising in the Soviet, in the Russian Federation once this war ends. I mean, let's first see how this war ends, and I think we'll have a clearer picture.
Right, and I would say I actually happen to have just spent some time with a person, with a Russian journalist, independent Russian journalist, who's done a lot of reporting, who has an independent news outlet, amazingly still inside of Russia. They're blocked, but they continue reporting, specifically from the Burat Republic. And there is nothing approaching any kind of rebellion sentiment there. People feel very, as the coffins come in, people feel quite patriotic, and they want to justify the sacrifice by saying that this is, we had to do anyway. It's certainly not in the near future. I don't. Right. I also don't want to predict anything, but the current sentiment is not at all there. I know people often ask, will this lead to a revolt? Will that lead to a revolt? I think as a lot of Americans like to ask that question, but,
right?
Or it never happens.
Right.
I think it's hard for Americans a lot of times to understand why don't people stand up to all of that's happening. Okay, so we have a question from Professor Anne Dayton from University of Oxford. So she says, thank you, fascinating. Question 1, are you saying that the Stalin speech was doctored? And if so, what happened to the original? Number 2, can you elaborate on where religious dimension of wartime heroism fitted into all of this?
Yeah, so was the speech doctored? No. I mean, yes, it was doctored for the Pravda version that came out the next morning. It was edited slightly, and there's some interesting edits, but we have all the documents. We have the original speech. We have its editing process. You can see its editing process. And by the way, this is archival documents, but this is actually published. So you can purchase the toasts, its editing process, and everything. It's totally available. So no, it wasn't doctored. In the Pravda version that came out, it was slightly tweaked a bit to be a little more pithy, but it wasn't doctored in any substantial way. The Russian comment was there, and so on. It's interesting also that another thing that passed through this process of drafting it, editing it, and putting it in the newspaper the next day, was they kept the part about the Soviet government's mistakes, right, in the early years of the war. And this was often seen at the time. The Western press picked this up. The New York Times, for example, said that, you know, in the West, Russian and Soviet were used interchangeably during the war. And so in the West, they didn't even pick up this symbolic importance of highlighting the Russian people. The only thing they mentioned was, one, Stalin seemed to be in one of his jolliest moods in years, right? And number two, that he admitted Soviet government mistakes. That was the most important thing in the New York Times when this thing was printed. But no, you can read the whole process of editing it and everything. You can actually access it in Ergaspi also, one of the archives. The second question, where religious dimension? Okay. The religious dimension plays an important role during the war itself. Okay, so there was, you know, famously, there was the restoration of the Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church became a sort of mouthpiece for the war effort during the war. So the church was partly restored during the war, but its messaging was, you know, I call this kind of kitchen sink patriotism. So during the war itself, in this life and death struggle, the state threw everything against the wall, hoping something would stick to motivate people to fight. One of those things happened to be the church, right? But the church, this was very tightly controlled, and it was reined in late in the war by 1944, 45. You already have religious messaging totally reined in. Religion plays an important role, though, in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. And I track this in my book, one of the reasons for the manifestation of this large-scale commemorative cult of the war was because, as part of this crisis of patriotic identity that I really quickly went through, was a shocking rise among Russian youths of religious belief and religious practice, you know, covertly in the Soviet era. And so you have these debates where they're saying, well, we need to come up with rituals that can appeal to people's emotions, you know? So they propose new style birth registries, new style weddings, and, you know, things like this, like civic rituals, right? And then they say, but, you know, those don't really have the same kind of appeal. And so one of the proposals that comes in, and this helps lead to this large scale commemorative cult of the war, is to say that, you know what has that kind of appeals to people's sort of existential place in the world? The World War II victory, the Great Patriotic War. And so in a way, the decisions so we're talking from 1960, 61, 62, the decisions that we want to create this large scale commemorative cult of the war, they all point out that this will actually steal the thunder of the sort of religious, lingering religious sort of curiosity among Soviet youth.
Fascinating. Okay, so I can't believe we just have 2 minutes left. We have too many questions. So I'm just going to ask you the last question, and I apologize to those whose questions we didn't get. During your research, this is from Scott Majala, during your research, how did the pan-Soviet viewpoint spin the help they received from Western nations during World War II? So how did they address that?
The Soviet World War II victory narrative, it emerges and begins crystallizing in the context of the very, very early Cold War. Well, even a little bit before this, but you already have tensions playing out. You can see in the discussions of the lecture bureau, for example, and other sort of ideological and propaganda organs, agitprop, for example. You see discussions and concerns that the initial World War II narratives coming out of the West are really playing up their own role, especially America's role. Americans were saying that we were the decisive force in the war against Hitler. Okay, and they're saying, well, the Soviets, or the Russians, as they called them, they played a role in the war as our ally, but really they succeeded in spite of the Soviet system, in spite of Stalin, in spite of the Communist Party. So what led to the Soviet successes in the war? It was general winter, right? So the climactic conditions of the Soviet Union. So they're playing up winter. Also, the Russian soul and the Russian sort of almost barbarism in this fight, right? these things, in a way, and their appeal to Russian nationalism, what they called it, right? So look at Stalin's speech about the great ancestors, right? This is proof that socialist ideology doesn't work, right? It doesn't mobilize, it doesn't do any of this. When the Soviet planners and propagandists and ideologists were coming up with how to counter this, it was decided to drop a lot of this Russocentric stuff insofar as it concerned the war. Part of this process, though, implicitly, as it sort of manifested, was to downplay, of course, the American side, to downplay the Allies, to downplay that stuff, which up until 1945, 46 was still there in the messaging of the war. That disappears very quickly, all in the context of Cold War escalation and increasing tensions.
Jonathan, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I highly recommend that people get your book. I want to thank once again the HAP program. I want to thank everyone who helped organize this event and the audience, and we'll see you at our next discussion.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.